There is something strange about growing old. People stop asking who you are and start deciding who you used to be. My name is William Carter. I am 72 years old. I wake up every morning at 6, make my own coffee, and sit by the kitchen window before the rest of the house is awake. I have followed that routine for as long as I can remember. People often mistake a quiet life for an empty one. I learned that lesson many years ago. For the last 12 years, I have lived in a modest guest house behind my son-in-law's beautiful home in Virginia. It is small, but I have never minded. I have always believed that peace matters more than square footage. My daughter Emily used to ask me why I never bought a larger place for myself. I would simply smile and tell her that an old man doesn't need very much. Somewhere along the way, she stopped asking. My son-in-law, Daniel, never asked at all. Daniel is a successful financial consultant. He is intelligent, disciplined, and respected by almost everyone who knows him. He takes great pride in being responsible with money. In fact, I believe that is one of the reasons my daughter fell in love with him. Over the years, I watched him become a wonderful husband and a devoted father to my grandchildren. I have never hated him. That would make this story much easier to tell, but it would not be true. People are rarely all good or all bad. Daniel simply believed what he saw. He saw an old man wearing the same watch for 20 years. He saw someone who preferred fixing old things instead of buying new ones. He saw someone who drove an aging sedan and never spent money on himself. Eventually, he stopped seeing anything else. 12 years is a long time to misunderstand someone. I remember the day he first offered to help me organize my finances. Emily had been worried that I was handling too much by myself. Daniel sat beside me at the dining table and spoke gently. "You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else," he said. "It's our turn to help." There was kindness in his voice that day. I know there was. I thanked him and told him I appreciated his concern. From that moment on, he slowly began paying more attention to my spending habits than I did. If I bought something unnecessary, he would ask about it. If I paid for dinner, he would quietly remind me that retirement money should be spent carefully. At first, I found it amusing. Then I realized something had changed. He no longer saw me as William Carter. I had become something else in his mind. I was the old man everyone needed to worry about. He assumed my monthly retirement check was all I had left. I never corrected him because there never seemed to be a reason to do so. You learn something after living more than 7 decades. Not every misunderstanding needs to be challenged. Sometimes people reveal more about themselves when they believe they already know everything. So I remained quiet. Perhaps that was my mistake. Over time, Daniel became more protective of my finances. He frequently reminded me that retirement isn't what it used to be. Inflation was rising. Healthcare costs were unpredictable. Older people, he said, should avoid unnecessary expenses. He meant well. At least, I believe he did in the beginning. But concern can become control when left unchecked. There were moments when I noticed him watching me while I paid for groceries, or wondering aloud whether I should stop carrying so many credit cards. "You don't really need all of them," he laughed one afternoon. I laughed with him and changed the subject. The truth is, I have never cared very much about money. What money gives you is freedom, nothing more and nothing less. And freedom is something I have protected my entire life. Several months ago, I noticed Daniel becoming increasingly uncomfortable whenever I offered to pay for something. Whether it was my grandson's birthday dinner or a family gathering during the holidays, he would insist that I save my money. "You've done enough," he would tell me. Perhaps he believed he was protecting me. Perhaps he was protecting the version of me he had created in his own mind. I never asked. Then one evening, Emily called and invited me to dinner. "It'll just be family," she said cheerfully. "Dad, don't say no this time." I smiled and promised I would be there. It sounded like an ordinary family dinner. I had no idea it would become the beginning of something that would change the way my son-in-law saw me forever. And before the night was over, he would ask me to do something I never expected to hear from someone I considered family. The next morning, I sat alone on my porch longer than usual. Emily's invitation to dinner should have felt ordinary. After all, our family gathered around that table more times than I could count. Yet something in her voice lingered with me after we hung up the phone. Perhaps it was because she sounded nervous. Or perhaps it was because, at 72 years old, you learn to recognize when people are about to ask you for something difficult. I poured myself another cup of coffee and smiled at the thought. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. By that afternoon, I had almost forgotten about it. My grandson, Ethan, stopped by after school to say hello. He was 16 now and nearly taller than I was. Teenagers change so quickly that it sometimes feels as though they grow older overnight. Grandpa, he laughed as he sat beside me, Mom said we're all having dinner tomorrow. So I've heard. You should bring one of your stories. What kind of story? The military ones. I smiled quietly. Ethan has always been fascinated by my past, although I rarely speak about it. Young people often imagine exciting lives hidden behind old photographs and faded memories. The truth is that some stories become more valuable when they remain untold. I think I'll just bring dessert this time, I told him. He laughed before shaking his head. Grandpa, that's because you never tell us anything. Perhaps he was right. For most of my life, I have preferred listening over speaking. There is something comforting about sitting quietly while everyone else fills the silence around you. You learn more that way. That evening, I found myself thinking about Daniel again. If someone had asked me to describe him honestly, I would have called him hardworking and dependable. He loves my daughter and has spent 12 years building a beautiful life with her. None of that would be a lie. But there was another truth I could no longer ignore. Daniel liked being needed. He enjoyed solving problems before anyone asked him to. He liked managing things that felt out of control. Most of all, he liked believing he was protecting the people he loved. There is nothing wrong with that unless you begin confusing protection with permission. I realized that somewhere along the way, he had quietly given himself permission to manage my life as well. It did not happen all at once. That is rarely how these things happen. It begins with simple questions. Are you sure you should buy that? Then it becomes friendly suggestions. You should probably save your money. Eventually, suggestions become expectations. You don't need all of these credit cards. And if enough time passes, expectations become decisions made on your behalf. Daniel never meant to disrespect me. At least, I do not believe that he did in the beginning. The problem with assumptions is that they become invisible after a while. Once people decide who you are, they stop asking questions. They simply continue the conversation they have already created in their own minds. To Daniel, I was a retired old man surviving on monthly retirement payments and careful spending habits. Everything else about me slowly disappeared from view. I allowed that misunderstanding to continue because it was harmless, or at least I believed it was. Looking back now, I wonder whether silence sometimes becomes its own kind of dishonesty. My daughter called again later that evening. Dad, she asked carefully, you are coming tomorrow, aren't you? Of course. You sound happy. Shouldn't I? She laughed softly before saying something that caught my attention. Daniel has been worried about you lately. There it was again. Worried. Everyone seemed worried about me these days except for the only person who knew whether I needed worrying about. And why is that? I asked gently. Oh, you know how he is, she replied. He's always thinking ahead. Thinking ahead. That phrase stayed with me long after we finished speaking. The following afternoon, I stopped at the grocery store before heading home. I picked up a few things Ethan likes and paid with one of my credit cards before placing it back into my wallet. An older gentleman standing beside me smiled and joked, "Retirement isn't getting any cheaper these days." "No," I replied with a laugh. "It certainly isn't." He glanced toward my silver hair before adding, "The important thing is having family around." I smiled politely because he was right. Family is one of life's greatest blessings. It can also become one of life's greatest lessons. That evening, I opened my desk drawer and found myself staring at several old documents I had not touched in years. There are moments in life when the past quietly waits for the future to catch up with it. This was one of those moments. I closed the drawer again without saying a word. Some truths reveal themselves when they are ready. Dinner was less than 24 hours away, and although I did not know it yet, my son-in-law had already decided what he was going to ask me to do. The following evening, I arrived a few minutes early. Emily has always been punctual. If dinner was at 6 o'clock, she would have everything prepared by 5:30. Some habits remain unchanged no matter how many years pass. When I walked through the front door, I was greeted by the familiar sounds of laughter coming from the kitchen. Ethan was helping his younger sister set the table while Emily finished preparing dinner. For a moment, it felt like every other family gathering we had shared over the past 12 years. That is the difficult thing about life. Sometimes, the moments that change everything begin exactly like ordinary days. "Grandpa!" My granddaughter Sophie shouted as she ran toward me. I laughed softly before kneeling to hug her. "You've grown taller since last week." "That's impossible," she replied confidently. I smiled because children always find a way to make you laugh. Daniel appeared a few moments later carrying a tray of drinks. He smiled warmly before shaking my hand. "I'm glad you came," he said. "So am I." There was nothing unusual about his voice or expression. If anything, He seemed happier than usual. That should have reassured me. Instead, I found myself paying closer attention than I normally would. Dinner conversations have always fascinated me. People reveal more about themselves over a meal than they realize. Their priorities become visible in the questions they ask and the things they choose to notice. That evening, Daniel noticed my wallet. It was resting beside my plate when I excused myself to help Emily bring dessert to the table. "You still carry that old thing?" He laughed. I smiled. "It still works. You've been saying that for 10 years. And I've been right for 10 years. Everyone laughed politely before the conversation moved elsewhere. 20 minutes later, Ethan began talking excitedly about college applications, while Sophie proudly announced that she wanted to become a lawyer someday. "I'll need a very large salary," she explained confidently. "Why is that?" I asked. "Because I want to buy Grandpa a giant house." The entire table laughed as I thanked her for her generosity. "You already have a place to live," Daniel joked before taking another sip of his drink. There was nothing offensive about the comment itself. In fact, most people would probably have laughed and moved on. But words become interesting when you remember the person saying them has spent 12 years believing he understands your entire life. After dinner, Emily quietly excused herself to answer an important phone call while the children went upstairs to finish their homework. For the first time that evening, Daniel and I were alone at the dining room table. He sat quietly for several moments before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He smiled politely before folding his hands together on the table. "You know I've always treated you like family." "I know. And you know everything I've ever said has only been because I care about you." "I know that too." He seemed relieved by my answer. I've actually been thinking about something for quite a while now. There was something different about his tone now. It was no longer casual conversation. This was the real reason for tonight's dinner. I remained silent and allowed him to continue. "You've worked hard your entire life," he said. "You've earned the right to enjoy retirement without worrying about unnecessary financial problems." I smiled politely. "That's very kind of you." He nodded before continuing. "The truth is, I've been a little concerned lately." Concern again. It is remarkable how often people use that word when they are preparing to make decisions for someone else. "I've noticed that you're still using several credit cards," he said carefully. "And honestly, I don't think that's a good idea anymore." There it was. Not unexpected. Yet hearing him say it aloud felt strangely different. "You don't really need them," he continued. "At this point in your life, simpler is better." I remained quiet and allowed him to speak. "You have your retirement check every month. You don't spend very much. Carrying multiple credit cards only creates unnecessary risks." He paused briefly before leaning slightly closer. "Dad, I think it's time to cancel them." For just a moment, the entire room became perfectly silent. There was no anger in his voice, no cruelty, no disrespect that he could recognize, only absolute certainty that he knew what was best for me. He had already made his decision before I ever sat down at that table. He simply needed me to agree with it. And what happened next would surprise him more than anything else that evening, because I smiled and quietly said two words he never expected to hear. "Of course." Daniel smiled after hearing my answer. It was the smile of someone who believes a difficult conversation has gone better than expected. "I'm glad you understand," he said as he relaxed back into his chair. "Honestly, I was worried you might take this the wrong way." "I don't see any reason to," I replied calmly. For the first time that evening, he seemed completely at ease. There is something fascinating about human nature. People often mistake agreement for understanding. They assume that if you do not argue, you must believe exactly what they believe. I learned many years ago that silence allows people to reveal themselves more honestly than questions ever could. "You've always been reasonable," Daniel continued. "That's one of the things I admire most about you." I smiled politely without saying anything else. He interpreted my silence as encouragement and continued speaking. "The truth is, Emily and I have been talking about this for a while." Those words caught my attention more than anything he had said all evening. "Emily had never mentioned any of this to me." "Have you?" I asked softly. He nodded. "She's been worried too." Perhaps she had been. Or perhaps she simply trusted her husband enough to believe he was doing what was best for everyone involved. I could hardly blame her for that. Daniel leaned forward slightly before continuing. "You've done more than enough for this family. There's nothing left for you to prove." Nothing left. It was interesting hearing those words spoken aloud. Over the last 12 years, I had heard variations of that sentence many times. "You should slow down. You've done enough. You don't need to worry anymore." Each sentence sounded thoughtful and compassionate on the surface. Yet they all carried the same quiet assumption underneath. Your time has passed. You have become someone who needs protecting rather than someone capable of protecting others. I have often wondered when society decided growing older meant becoming less capable of making our own decisions. Perhaps it happened so gradually that nobody notices. Daniel continued speaking about interest rates, financial security, and simplifying retirement expenses. He spoke with confidence and genuine concern. I listened patiently because there was no reason not to. Then he said something that made me realize this conversation was never really about credit cards at all. I've actually been reviewing your spending habits over the past several months. I looked at him quietly. My spending habits? He smiled as though he had expected the question. Nothing inappropriate, he explained quickly. I've only been paying attention whenever we're together. He laughed softly before adding, "You're too generous sometimes." I found that statement amusing. Am I? You bought Ethan that laptop last month. Then there was Sophie's birthday present. You paid for dinner during Christmas. Dad, that's unnecessary. Unnecessary. Another interesting word. I looked around the dining room for a moment before asking, do they seem unhappy when I do those things? Well, no. Then why are they unnecessary? He hesitated briefly before answering. Because you're retired now. You should be thinking about yourself. There are moments in life when you realize two people are having entirely different conversations. Daniel believed we were discussing financial responsibility. I knew we were discussing assumptions. He saw expenses. I saw family. You've spent your entire life taking care of people, he continued. At some point, you have to let other people take care of you. Again, there was kindness in his words. That is what made this situation so complicated. Cruelty is easy to recognize. Misguided kindness often isn't. I appreciate your concern, I said sincerely. I truly do. He smiled gratefully before continuing. I've actually already spoken with someone at my bank about retirement planning options. If you'd like, I could help consolidate some of your accounts and make things much easier moving forward. I laughed softly before taking another sip of my coffee. You've planned quite a lot already. He smiled proudly. I like being prepared. That much was certainly true. For 12 years, Daniel had prepared for every possible financial situation our family might face. There was only one thing he had forgotten to prepare for: the possibility that he was wrong. He had spent 12 years believing my monthly retirement check was my entire world. 12 years assuming every financial decision I made required careful supervision. And 12 years without asking me a single question that truly mattered. Not once had he ever asked what I had done before retirement. Not once had he asked why I seemed strangely unconcerned about money. And not once had he wondered how someone could remain so calm whenever financial matters were discussed. Assumptions are dangerous things. The longer we hold them, the more difficult they become to question. Daniel finally smiled and asked the question he had been waiting to ask all evening. So you'll cancel the cards tomorrow? I smiled warmly before giving him the same answer I had already given once that evening. Of course. The relief on his face was immediate. He believed the conversation was over. He had absolutely no idea that it had only just begun. I slept well that night. That may sound strange considering the conversation I had just shared with my son-in-law, but age teaches you an important lesson. You cannot control what other people choose to believe about you. You can only control how you respond when those beliefs are finally spoken aloud. I had made my choice long ago. There would be no arguments, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations across the dinner table. Life has given me enough of those already. When I woke the following morning, I followed my usual routine. I made coffee, read the morning newspaper, and watched the sun slowly rise above the trees behind my guest house. Everything felt exactly as it had the day before. The only difference was that Daniel believed something important had changed. He believed I had finally accepted that I needed his help. What he didn't realize was that I had accepted something entirely different. I had accepted that 12 years was long enough. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Emily. Dad, I wanted to make sure you weren't upset about last night. Should I be? There was a brief silence before she laughed softly. I suppose not. Emily, I said gently, do you believe I'm incapable of making my own decisions? No, of course not. Then why would I be upset? She hesitated for several moments before answering. I think Daniel is just afraid something might happen to you financially. I smiled quietly because I knew she believed that with all her heart. When did I become someone's financial emergency? I asked jokingly. She laughed. Never. At least, that was her answer. We spoke for several more minutes before saying goodbye. She sounded relieved that I wasn't angry, and I was glad for that. The last thing I ever wanted was to become a source of conflict within my family. After hanging up, I found myself thinking about something Daniel had said the previous evening. There's nothing left for you to prove. It is remarkable how differently people understand success. For some people, success means accumulating wealth. For others, it means earning respect or building a successful career. For me, success has always meant something much simpler. Freedom. The freedom to help the people you love without asking for anything in return. The freedom to remain silent when others misunderstand you. And perhaps most importantly, the freedom to decide who deserves the truth about your life. I have never been interested in impressing anyone. If I were, I would have spent the last 12 years living very differently. There are things Daniel does not know about me because I never felt the need to tell him. There are also things he never asked. Sometimes, I wonder which of those matters more. That afternoon, Ethan came to visit me again. He had brought his laptop because he was struggling with one of his college essays. "What are you writing about?" I asked. "Success," he replied. I couldn't help but laugh at the coincidence. "And what does success mean to you?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Making enough money so I can take care of the people I love." There was something wonderfully simple about his answer. "You've been listening to your mother," I joked. "No," he laughed. "I've been listening to you." For reasons I still cannot explain, his answer stayed with me long after he returned home that afternoon. Money is an interesting thing. People spend their entire lives chasing it only to discover that what they truly wanted was what money makes possible. Security, freedom, peace, and the ability to say yes when the people you love need you most. That evening, I opened my desk drawer once again. Inside were several documents that had remained untouched for years. I carefully read through them before quietly placing them back inside. There would come a time when conversations about money could no longer remain hypothetical. That time was approaching much faster than anyone realized. 2 days passed before Daniel called me unexpectedly. "Dad," he said cheerfully, "I spoke with someone about simplifying your finances." "Did you? I think you'll really like the options they suggested." I smiled despite myself. His determination would have been admirable under different circumstances. "You've certainly been busy." He laughed softly before continuing. "There's actually something else I'd like to discuss with you when you have time." "And what's that?" "It can wait until Sunday dinner." Sunday dinner. There it was again. Another family gathering, another conversation about my future, and another decision that seemed to have already been made without my participation. I smiled quietly before agreeing. Sunday sounds fine. By the time I hung up the phone, I realized something had changed. This was no longer about credit cards. It had become something much larger than that. Daniel had spent 12 years believing he understood exactly who I was. He was about to discover how dangerous assumptions can become when they survive for far too long. And before Sunday dinner was over, he would ask me a question that would change everything between us forever. Sunday arrived sooner than I expected. There was something almost amusing about watching life continue, as though nothing unusual was happening. The birds still sang outside my window every morning. The coffee tasted exactly the same. Even the weather remained pleasantly warm for early spring in Virginia. Only people had changed. Or perhaps they hadn't changed at all. Perhaps I was simply beginning to see them more clearly. I arrived at Emily and Daniel's home shortly before 6 o'clock. The children greeted me at the door as they always did, and for a brief moment I wondered if I had imagined the growing tension between Daniel and me over the previous week. Then I noticed the stack of papers resting neatly beside his laptop on the dining room table. No, I hadn't imagined any of it. Daniel smiled warmly as he welcomed me inside. "I'm glad you could make it. I wouldn't miss family dinner," I replied honestly. He seemed unusually excited that evening. Looking back now, I believe he thought he was about to solve a problem that had been troubling him for years. There is something admirable about people who genuinely want to help others. The danger comes when they become so convinced they know what is best that they stop listening altogether. Dinner passed pleasantly enough. Ethan talked excitedly about visiting colleges, while Sophie spent 20 minutes explaining why she deserved a puppy. Emily laughed more than she spoke, which usually meant she was trying to keep everyone else happy. Some things never change. When dessert was finally served, Daniel cleared his throat before smiling in my direction. "Dad, do you mind staying for a few minutes after dinner? There's something I'd like to show you." Emily immediately looked surprised. "What is it?" she asked. "Oh, nothing bad," Daniel laughed. "I've just been working on something for him." There was genuine pride in his voice. I smiled politely before nodding my agreement. "Of course." An hour later, the children disappeared upstairs to finish their homework, while Emily quietly began cleaning the kitchen. That left Daniel and me sitting across from one another once again at the dining room table. He opened his laptop before carefully organizing the papers beside him. "I've spent quite a bit of time looking into retirement planning options," he began enthusiastically. "I'm sure you have. You've earned the right to live comfortably without financial stress." There was that word again. Comfortably. I wondered if he had ever considered asking me whether I was already comfortable. He continued speaking for nearly 15 minutes. There were charts showing projected retirement expenses and recommendations for simplifying monthly finances. He had even prepared a suggested budget based upon what he believed my monthly retirement income to be. I listened quietly without interrupting him once. Finally, he turned his laptop toward me with a satisfied smile. "If we consolidate everything, you'll actually have more financial security moving forward." Everything. An interesting choice of words, considering he had absolutely no idea what everything actually included. He pointed towards several highlighted figures displayed on his screen. "You don't need multiple accounts or several credit cards at this stage of your life. Simplicity is better." I smiled politely before asking a simple question. "And if I prefer things exactly as they are?" He laughed softly as though I were joking. "Then I'd say you're being stubborn." His answer didn't offend me. In fact, it made me unexpectedly sad. For 12 years, he had genuinely convinced himself that he understood my life better than I did. He wasn't asking what I wanted anymore. He was explaining why I was wrong. "You know," he continued thoughtfully, "I think one of the hardest things about getting older is accepting help when we need it." There was kindness in his voice when he said those words. That is what made them so dangerous. He wasn't trying to insult me. He was trying to save me from becoming the person he had already decided I was. Finally, he slid several documents across the table toward me. "If you're comfortable with everything, we can start by closing most of your credit card accounts." For the first time that evening, I looked down at the papers resting between us. There were signature lines waiting patiently at the bottom of every page. Daniel smiled warmly before continuing. "You don't have to worry about any of this anymore. I'll make sure everything is taken care of." Everything. Once again, he had made a promise without realizing how impossible it was to keep. I quietly folded my hands together before looking back at him. "Daniel," I asked gently, "may I ask you one question?" "Of course. During the 12 years you've known me, have you ever wondered what I did before I retired?" For the first time that evening, his smile disappeared completely. He stared at me silently for several seconds before finally answering. "No," he admitted quietly. "I suppose I never thought it mattered." I smiled softly before taking another sip of my coffee. That answer explained far more than he could possibly imagine. And for the very first time in 12 years, my son-in-law was beginning to realize there were entire chapters of my life he had never bothered to read. I spent the next 2 days thinking about our conversation. Not because I was offended by Daniel's words, but because I realized something much more troubling had happened over the last 12 years. He had never been curious about me. People who love you ask questions. They want to know who you were before they met you and who you hope to become tomorrow. They remember the stories you tell and wonder about the ones you don't. Daniel knew my favorite coffee and the television programs I enjoyed watching before bed. He knew I preferred sweaters over jackets and that I always ordered apple pie whenever we went out to dinner. Yet he knew almost nothing about the man sitting across from him every Sunday evening. That realization saddened me far more than anything he had said about money. Thursday afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call. "Mr. Carter?" "Speaking." "This is Michael Harrison from Harrison and Wells Financial Group. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." I smiled quietly. It had been nearly 3 months since we last spoke. "Not at all, Michael. How are you?" "I'm doing very well, sir. I wanted to let you know we've completed everything we discussed previously." "Excellent." He paused briefly before continuing. "There are a few documents I'd still like your signature on. Would next week work for you?" "That should be fine." We spoke for another 10 minutes before ending the call. There was nothing particularly unusual about our conversation. At least, there wouldn't have been if anyone else had overheard it. Later that evening, Ethan stopped by to borrow one of my books for a school project. As he gathered his things to leave, he paused beside the doorway and smiled. "Can I ask you something, Grandpa?" "Of course." "Were you always this calm?" I laughed softly before asking, "What makes you ask that?" "Dad worries about everything," he explained. "Mom worries about Dad worrying about everything. Sophie worries about her math homework. You don't seem worried about anything. There are questions children ask that adults spend years trying to answer." "I worry about many things," I told him honestly. "You don't look like it." I smiled before pointing toward the chair across from me. "Sit down for a minute." He immediately sat beside me. waiting patiently for whatever wisdom he expected an old man to share. When I was your age, I began quietly, I thought strength meant winning every argument. What changed? Life. He laughed softly before waiting for me to continue. As I grew older, I discovered something important. Most arguments aren't worth winning. Peace is. He nodded thoughtfully before asking, so that's why you never get angry? Oh, I get angry sometimes. You do? Of course. When? I couldn't help but smile at the question. Usually when people underestimate the people they love. For reasons I cannot explain, I found myself thinking about Daniel as I said those words. Ethan smiled before standing to leave. You know, he said as he picked up his book, Dad thinks you're the wisest person in our family. That caught me completely by surprise. He does? All the time. I watched him disappear through the doorway before quietly laughing to myself. Life truly does enjoy its little ironies. The following Sunday, Daniel called unexpectedly. Dad, are you free tomorrow afternoon? I should be. I was wondering if you'd like me to come by and help organize some of your financial paperwork. Financial paperwork. I had to smile at his persistence. That's very thoughtful of you. So tomorrow works? For several moments, I considered politely declining his offer. Then I realized something important. There are moments in life when people deserve exactly what they ask for. Tomorrow would be fine, I replied calmly. Perfect, he said enthusiastically. I'll stop by around 2. After hanging up the phone, I walked quietly toward my study and opened the drawer that had remained closed for so many years. Inside were documents representing an entire lifetime of decisions, sacrifices, and responsibilities. 12 years ago, I chose never to speak about any of them. Tomorrow, that choice would finally belong to someone else. Daniel was coming to help organize my financial paperwork. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him inside that drawer. Monday afternoon arrived quietly. I spent most of the morning tending to the small garden beside my guest house before returning inside to make coffee. It has always amazed me how ordinary life feels moments before something extraordinary happens. At precisely 2 o'clock, I heard Daniel's car pull into the driveway. Some things about him have never changed. He is punctual, organized, and always prepared. Today would be no exception. The only difference was that he believed he knew exactly what he was preparing for. He greeted me warmly as I opened the door. I hope I'm not early. You're exactly on time. He smiled before walking inside, carrying his laptop bag and several folders tucked neatly beneath his arm. You'd be surprised how much easier life becomes once finances are properly organized, he joked. I smiled quietly. I've been hearing that a lot lately. He laughed politely before taking a seat at my dining table. For nearly 20 minutes, he spoke enthusiastically about budgeting, retirement planning, and simplifying financial responsibilities. There was genuine excitement in his voice. Helping people wasn't simply his profession, it was part of who he was. Unfortunately, he had spent 12 years helping the version of me that existed only inside his imagination. Finally, he opened his laptop and smiled confidently. We'll start with the basics, he explained. Checking accounts, retirement income, credit cards, monthly expenses, and investment statements. That sounds reasonable. He looked around my modest living room before asking the question I had been expecting for years. Do you keep everything here? I do. He nodded approvingly. Good. That will make this much easier. I stood quietly before walking toward my study. The same drawer I had opened countless times over the last 12 years waited patiently in front of me. There was something strangely symbolic about finally reaching for it today. Inside rested several folders, neatly organized exactly where I had left them. Nothing about them looked particularly impressive at first glance. That seemed appropriate somehow. Appearances have always been terribly misleading. When I returned to the dining room, Daniel smiled politely before reaching for the first folder. So this would be your retirement information? No. No? Try opening it. He laughed softly before removing the first document from the folder. His expression remained unchanged for several seconds before the smile slowly disappeared from his face. Then he quietly looked back at me. I don't understand. Which part? He looked down at the document once more before reading it again. This can't be right. It usually is. For nearly 30 seconds, he said absolutely nothing. He wasn't confused because of what he was reading. He was confused because the document in his hands simply didn't belong to the version of me he had spent 12 years creating inside his mind. Finally, he spoke again. What exactly is Harrison and Wells Financial Group? A firm that's represented me for quite some time. He slowly lifted his eyes toward mine. Represented you for what? I smiled softly before sitting across from him. That depends on which decade you're asking about. He laughed nervously, as though I had made a joke neither of us understood. Then he opened the second folder. The silence that followed lasted much longer this time. He stopped asking questions after that. There are moments when people become so surprised that curiosity quietly gives way to disbelief. This was one of those moments. He opened another document before immediately reading it a second time. Then a third. Then a fourth. I simply sat quietly beside my coffee and watched 12 years of assumptions slowly begin to unravel. "Dad," he finally asked softly, "why have I never seen any of this before?" "You never asked." He immediately lowered his eyes toward the papers once again. There was no anger in his expression now, only confusion. For 12 years, Daniel believed he understood my relationship with money because he had seen me pay for groceries and birthday presents. He had mistaken simplicity for limitation and modesty for necessity. The truth was infinitely more complicated than that. He looked back at me once again before asking another question. "Emily doesn't know about any of this either, does she?" "No." "Why?" I smiled quietly before answering honestly. "Because I never thought she needed to." The room became perfectly silent once again. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel wasn't explaining my finances to me. He was trying to understand who I really was. And we had only just begun opening the drawer. Daniel remained seated long after he finished reading the last document. For nearly 10 minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence between two people changes when the truth finally arrives. This wasn't the uncomfortable silence of an argument or the awkward silence of strangers who have nothing left to say. It was something else entirely. It was the sound of assumptions quietly falling apart. Finally, he placed the documents carefully back inside their folders before looking at me once again. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." "No," he replied softly. "I think I do." There was no defensiveness left in his voice now. No confidence. No carefully prepared explanations waiting patiently behind his next sentence. For the first time in 12 years, Daniel wasn't speaking to the old man he thought he knew. He was speaking to a stranger. "What did you do before you retired?" he asked quietly. I smiled softly. "I've had several careers over the years." He laughed nervously before shaking his head. "That's probably the most mysterious answer you've ever given me. It's probably the most honest one." His eyes returned to the documents resting on the table between us. "You've known this entire time?" "Known what?" "What I thought about your finances." "Yes." "And you never corrected me?" "No." "Why not?" I thought about that question longer than any of the others he had asked that afternoon. "There are two kinds of people in this world," I finally answered. "The first ask questions before reaching conclusions. The second reach conclusions before asking questions." He lowered his eyes immediately. "I suppose I know which one I am." We've all been both people at different moments in our lives. There was no reason to make him feel worse than he already did. Life was handling that lesson perfectly well on its own. He remained quiet for several moments before speaking again. "I'm embarrassed." "Why?" "Because I spent 12 years believing I was protecting you." His voice had changed completely now. There was something painful about hearing genuine regret from someone who never intended to cause harm. "I know. I thought I was helping." "I know that too." The room became silent once again. He slowly removed his glasses before rubbing his eyes tiredly. "I asked you to cancel your credit cards." "You did." "I asked you to simplify your finances." "You did." "I prepared retirement plans based upon assumptions I never bothered to verify." "That's true." For the first time that afternoon, I saw him smile weakly. "You make it sound much worse when you repeat it back to me." I laughed softly before replying, "That's because you've finally heard yourself say it." He laughed quietly despite himself. There are moments when people discover that wisdom and intelligence are not always the same thing. Daniel was experiencing one of those moments now. "Can I ask one more question?" he asked. "Of course." "Were you ever angry with me?" The answer surprised him. "No." "Never?" "Disappointed sometimes, never angry." "Why?" I smiled quietly before looking toward the family photographs hanging beside the living room window. "Because you've loved my daughter faithfully for 12 years. You've been a wonderful father to my grandchildren. You care so deeply about this family that you occasionally forget other people are capable of caring for themselves." He laughed softly before shaking his head. "That sounds like the kindest criticism I've ever received." "It wasn't criticism." "What was it?" "The truth." He smiled sadly before asking another question. "Then what disappointed you?" For several moments, I wasn't sure how to answer him. Finally, I spoke quietly. "You never asked who I was before deciding who I had become." Those words hurt him more than anything else I had said that afternoon. I could see it immediately in his expression. People can forgive being wrong much more easily than realizing they were never curious enough to discover the truth. His eyes slowly moved toward the old family photographs resting on my bookshelf. "I don't think I've asked enough questions about your life." "No," I replied gently. "You haven't." He nodded silently before speaking once more. "I owe you an apology." I smiled warmly before shaking my head. "No. You owe me curiosity." He stared at me for several seconds before laughing softly. "I think that's considerably more difficult." It usually is. When he finally stood to leave that afternoon, he quietly placed every document back inside its folder exactly as he had found it. Nothing about my finances had changed. Only his understanding of me had. As he reached the front door, he stopped and smiled awkwardly. "Dad?" "Yes?" "I'm beginning to realize I've spent 12 years knowing almost nothing about you." I smiled quietly before opening the door for him. "Then perhaps we finally found something worth talking about." The house felt unusually quiet after Daniel left that afternoon. I sat alone beside the window with my coffee growing cold in my hands and found myself smiling at something I never expected to feel. Relief. Not because the truth had finally been revealed, but because there were no raised voices, no broken relationships, and no bitterness waiting patiently at the end of our conversation. Life rarely gives us the opportunity to teach difficult lessons gently. This time it had. 3 days later, my phone rang shortly before dinner. "Dad?" Emily asked softly. "Hello, sweetheart." Daniel told me everything. I smiled quietly before asking, "Did he?" He said I should probably call and apologize. There was something strangely amusing about hearing those words. "And what exactly are you apologizing for?" "For not asking enough questions." Her answer surprised me more than anything else she could have said. Perhaps she understood her husband better than I realized. "He feels terrible," she continued quietly. "I've never seen him like this before. He'll be fine. I don't think that's what he's worried about." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then she asked the question I should have expected many years ago. "Who were you before you became my father?" I laughed softly before shaking my head. "That's a very long story. I think we have time." Perhaps we did. That Sunday, our entire family gathered together once again for dinner. Everything looked exactly as it always had. The same dining room table. The same laughter from my grandchildren. The same familiar faces I had loved for so many years. Only one thing was different. No one talked about my finances. Instead, Ethan asked me about my first job. Sophie wanted to know where I learned to remain so calm. Emily laughed while listening to stories she had somehow never heard before. Daniel asked more questions than anyone else at the table. For 12 years, he had been trying to protect me. Now, he was finally trying to know me. At one point during dinner, he smiled awkwardly before speaking. "You know," he laughed, "I still can't believe I asked you to cancel your credit cards." The entire table burst into laughter. "I remember that conversation quite clearly," I replied. "I don't suppose you'll ever let me forget it?" "Absolutely not." Even I couldn't resist laughing at that. Life has an interesting sense of humor sometimes. People often assume that the greatest gift we can give one another is our time or our generosity. I no longer believe that is true. The greatest gift we can offer the people we love is our curiosity. Ask them who they were before they became the person sitting across from you today. Ask them what they sacrificed and what they still dream about becoming tomorrow. Most importantly, never assume that growing older means becoming smaller. There are entire worlds hidden inside people we believe we already know. My son-in-law spent 12 years believing I had nothing left but a monthly retirement check. He was wrong about almost everything except one thing. I really did live a very simple life. I simply chose that life for myself. Money has never impressed me very much. Freedom always has. These days, Daniel still worries about me from time to time. I suspect that will never change. The difference is that he now asks questions before offering answers. I consider that progress. Last month, he handed me my coffee before smiling mischievously. "Dad," he asked, "how many credit cards do you actually have?" I laughed before taking a sip of my coffee. "More than you need to worry about." Some lessons don't require complicated endings. They simply ask us to become a little more curious and a little less certain than we were yesterday. After all, there are entire chapters of every person's life waiting patiently to be discovered. The people we love deserve at least that much.